Hello folks, my name is Shaw with Royal Tiger Imports, and today I'm here to show you all some MG42s, cover their variants, and show you some other components, accessories, parts, etc. To my left, I have this Italian produced MG42/59, and to my right, I have this Turkish produced MKE, is a manufacturer, MG3. And then, as I mentioned previously, I have quite a wide variety of components and accessories. Starting with, we'll just briefly overview these parts, starting with some drums. These particular drums, or girt trommels for belt drums, were for the original 34 and 42 in 8mm Mauser. There are also some post-World War II drums. Unfortunately, I do not have any of those here right now to show you, but you can view photos online of the MG1 762 NATO drum, which is extremely similar, as well as the MG3 plastic drum. Moving on, we have some top covers, starting with the earliest World War II German 8mm cover, then the M53, which is also an 8mm, very, very similar top cover, except for markings. And then we have some 762 NATO post-World War II covers, including the closest one to y'all, which is the MG3 cover with a very rare marking on it, which I will show you in detail shortly. In addition to that, we have the front ends off of an M53 Yugoslavian-produced MG42 clone, and then we also have an original World War II front end with one key difference there. Again, we'll go over that in closer detail. And then moving on, we have an original World War II bolt, and then the bolts of these two guns I will pull out, compare. They're generally speaking the exact same function. However, there are some differences in machining, bolt weight, etc. All of that has to do with, effectively in the end, fire rate. These fire rates vary wildly, from the original one being 1,500 rounds a minute of 8mm Mauser to some of the post-World War II variants being closer to 700 rounds a minute. And then we have some barrels and their barrel carriers. We have the original World War II German tan carrier here with appropriate markings, as well as the original barrel. And then we have this original carrier. However, this carrier has been refurbished. So this carrier has been repainted in what's referred to as a apple green color by the Yugoslavians, very, very likely by the Yugoslavians. And they're the exact same carrier, except just, again, this one has been refurbished. When you do see MG42 accessories that are in this color, it's almost a perfect guarantee that it has been Yugoslavian refurbished. You'll see that on other items, such as these drums. This drum in particular is a Yugoslavian produced one. You can tell by the markings. Again, I'll show this all in detail shortly. This one, the farthest one, is a original one shown by the manufacturer code, but both have been reconditioned. And then moving on, finally, we have some other components, such as the Recuperator rods and muzzle booster, etc. But before we go from front to back, covering all the differences and all the variants, let's just briefly cover the different types. So generally speaking, the best way to divide this and to make it not a complete confusing mess is to divide it into three different types. The first type would be your original German World War II MG42 and 8mm Mauser. They were produced roughly from 42 to 45, 1942 to 1945 to be exact, and they were all, generally speaking, about the exact same configuration. They had some changes in charging handle design and other components, but generally speaking, they got that design right perfect off the bat. I mean, they really revolutionized both manufacturing techniques and also just general ease of functionality with this design. They produced those for a relatively short time period, but they produced, generally speaking, by best records that we can find, about 350 to 400,000, on the possibly lower end, 350,000. Either way, that's incredible. In a full wartime economy, producing something like this at that rate is pretty astounding. And then our second type, for lack of a better term, is going to be our Yugoslavian M53. The Yugoslavian M53 is effectively almost an exact clone. It's in the original 8mm Mauser caliber, same bolt weight, the main difference being markings as well as some production simplifications. And it does make perfect sense that it's almost an exact same clone because the Yugoslavians were provided the tooling from Steyr post-World War II. And our third type, although this is the most complicated, is going to be our post-World War II 7.62 NATO guns. So this, generally speaking, starts with the MG1, which was the German attempt at just converting these existing guns into 7.62 NATO, or at least producing guns into 7.62 NATO. The key difference between the MG1 and an MG2 is that the MG2 is taking already existing Type 1, for lack of a better term, MG42s, and then reconfiguring them into 7.62 NATO. They would also later introduce different drum designs to go along with these 7.62 NATO ones, etc. We'll get into all those details shortly. And then you have other variants that came along later. This is all roughly throughout the late 50s to throughout the 60s. You have the MG1A1, the MG1A2, which is very similar to this MG42/59. Main key point being the bolt mass. The bolt mass on an MG42/59 is significantly heavier than any other variant. And then you have your MG1A3, often produced by Rheinmetall. In fact, this particular cover is an MG1A3, and key difference there among small changes being that they shorten the top cover. And then we have some other ones. Again, we've already covered the MG2, the last one being the MG3. The MG3 is pretty revolutionary in terms of the final iterative development. You've got the main key difference, at least at first glance, is the feed tray. The feed tray uses a totally new, at the time, type of drum developed by HK. This drum is a plastic drum that is similar in general shape to the original Gert Trommel, and then the 7.62 NATO Gert Trommel copies that look very, very similar to these. However, the HK drum uses a much beefier, easier to use hinge, as well as they can be stacked together. I'm sure from a manufacturing standpoint, having a plastic drum is a much faster version of manufacturing compared to the extremely complicated stampings. Although, again, plastic is not as durable as metal, so it's a pick and choose game at the end of the day. But without further ado, let's get into all of the differences from front to back on all of the MG42 variants.
All right, folks, let's start by covering the flash hiders and the muzzle boosters. Starting from the earliest one here at the lowest point, this is an original MG42 8mm flash hider and muzzle booster. The booster cone, which is this component on the right for this M53 one up top, is currently inside of this assembly here. And it may be a little bit hard to see, but you can see that it would be just in front of this section here in this general area. You can even see it through the holes ever so slightly. This particular muzzle design is the very first variation, and it is directly copied over by the M53. You can even tell that this is an M53 flash hider because of the S followed by a series of numbers along with a dash. That is generally applied to most Yugoslavian parts, and they also, on many of the Yugoslavian booster cones, they will electropencil in a number. It is a little bit hard to see, but many of them, if not all, have a electropencil number to match. Following this, we have the MG42/59. This is an Italian-produced example, and you can see it's still a two-piece design. However, the booster cone is slightly different. You can see that it is much shorter in overall length, and the internal diameter is slightly different for 7.62 NATO. And also, we have a very similar overall design for the what holds in the booster and acts as a flash hider component. However, there are additional holes, as you can see, all around, especially in the forward section with the knurling. And it's important to note while we're here that the front end of the 4259 with the welded in component here is slightly different from an original MG42 in 8mm. We can also take a stop here to see that there is a detent, for lack of a better term. There's a spring-loaded metal arm that comes down and locks into any of the square cuts here on the back of the flash hider and keeps it locked in place in its tightest position once it's screwed on. And finally, this is our MG3. You can notice that this is a one-piece design, and this is fairly revolutionary because it makes it so much easier for manufacturing. You can see there's also a slight difference in the teeth that are used to retain it with this spring-loaded arm. And there is also a slight difference in this sleeve that slides back and forth in this muzzle bearing. This sleeve also does have a slightly different internal diameter. Again, that has to do with the pressures for 7.62 NATO. And it's important to note that these sleeves and the whole purpose of these muzzle boosters is to, when the gun is firing, create a rearward motion of the barrel so that by its roller locking design, it can rather violently unlock and then function the rest of the gun. Now let's cover the differences in the barrel shrouds. Starting with the bottom barrel shroud example here, this is the German World War II example. And while at first glance it's extremely similar, there are two key differences. The first difference being that you can see there is this milled component that is riveted in to the barrel shroud on top. This is for mounting your anti-aircraft front sight, like a spider style sight, which we can see right here. So this peg goes in and locks in there, and that is your front sight, which of course is detachable for anti-aircraft use. That is used in combination with these three holes here, which would usually have a small metal L-shaped arm with a rear sight, a small aperture rear sight that acts as your rear sight for the anti-aircraft setup. So that would rest right here, going along the left side, coming back around. That rotates up 90 degrees, locks in place, and can be used. Unfortunately, we do not have an example of that, but again, that is easily available to look at online. And then moving on, we have the M53, and you can see that at first glance, it does, this particular one at least, does have these holes for the rear sight for the anti-aircraft setup. This one does not have its regular rear sight for whatever reason. But what's interesting about the M53s is that they do not have this machined piece riveted in to this particular spot. I assume this was some sort of either production simplification and or just a realization that they did not plan on using them against aircraft, or they had deemed them ineffective. Not exactly sure of the reasoning. However, they did decide to opt out of having the separately carried piece and just decided to run it without that capability. Moving on to the 42/59 and the MG3, for while we're covering them here, you can see the MG42-59 and the 3 do not have this stamping section whatsoever and just have a clear through hole. This is because of this component right here. This is a detachable, but if it's in use, it's meant to just stay on the gun. It's really detachable, particularly for gunsmith installation. This is a anti-aircraft sight assembly that folds into its own case. So you can see it's open in this position here, clamps back down. If we can get this case to stay open, clamps back into this assembly, and then folds like so for when you're not using it. And this is used with the standard front sight. So you do not have to carry around an extra anti-aircraft spider style sight, which could get lost or bent, damaged, etc. And instead, this, although it's a little hard to imagine, but you can see right here, this rear pin would go through this pinhole here where the shorter standard pin exists. And there's a hook on the front of this assembly. So it would hook into the front of the barrel shroud down there. The pin goes through and it's affixed. And this, as I mentioned previously, is effectively a semi-permanent installation. It's not something that you would be quickly detaching and reattaching, but if it's something that was deemed necessary, this could be easily installed within a matter of a few minutes. Now let's go over the top covers and the feed trays. Starting with our oldest one first, this is a standard German World War II top cover. These are for the 8mm cartridge. You can see that it is German right off the bat because this particular one has Eagle proof markings as well as a serial number. And this particular one also has a COF marking. It's a little bit hard to see there, but again, that 3-letter code is often seen on German World War II parts. And you can see at first glance also that they are a blued finish compared to some of the parkerized finish used in post-war applications. And here is our internal assembly. So you can see you have your swinging arm that, keep in mind, is not spring-loaded. So the original version and the M53 are non-spring loaded, so you do have to keep in mind where your bolt is and in which position this arm is when you go to close the top cover, or else you may damage some of the components. And you can see right here our pawls that move back and forth, as well as our feed tray. This is a full-length feed tray for the 8mm Mauser cartridge. And it's important to note that later 7.62 NATO versions are what's referred to as shortened feed trays and top covers. Now, the top cover itself from this point to this point remains the exact same length. When they refer to shortening, they refer to this section here to make up for the lack of length in a 7.62 NATO cartridge compared to 8mm Mauser. As you can see, there is no spacer at the front for any conversion. And also, you can see these two small arms on the lower left and lower right. These arms are for the belt drum. The belt drum effectively hooks in at the front and rotates on at a sideways motion to clip onto this feed tray here. And it's clipped on with this right here. So this is spring loaded and simply rotates onto the side of the feed tray. The M53 feed tray pictured here is effectively identical. As you can see, it still features the same internal components. So let's take a look at these. You can see again, it is non-spring loaded. So you do have to pay attention to what position that's in before you close the top cover. And our feed tray is effectively identical except for markings. It's important to note that in addition to many of the Yugoslavian parts being marked with a S followed by a series of numbers and often a dash in the middle of those numbers, you can also see sometimes they are marked with either a square with a 2 inside or a square with a BK stamp in it. That is almost immediately a giveaway that it's either Yugoslavian manufactured or sometimes a Yugoslavian refurbished component. Moving on, here is our MG42 MG1A3 top cover. So the very first major difference is going to be the length of the top cover in this section here. It's a little hard to see, but it is slightly shorter in length compared to this one here. And keep in mind, this 53 is effectively identical to the 42. In addition, we also have this spring-loaded section here, which means that in combination with a spring-loaded bolt peg that rides in this rail, this always returns to the same spot and prevents damage, especially when you have your bolt directly to the back. You're able to just close it directly on there. No worries about damaging parts. In addition, let's also show the feed tray length. Again, it's a little bit hard to see at first glance, but you do notice that the bottom one is shorter overall length for that 7.62 NATO cartridge. In addition, it's very important to note, while these drum feed clip-on lips effectively, they do look identical, but they are not the same length. So the original 8mm Gert trommels do not directly clip onto the 7.62 NATO trays. They do use their own style of drum. And finally, here is our MG3 feed tray, or the top cover rather. We will show the feed tray shortly. This particular one, as I mentioned previously, has a very rare marking on it. This, it's a little bit hard to see, but that has an Iranian crest on it, made for Iran. These are made by Rheinmetall, and it's a very similar crest to what you would find on some of the very early Lugers and other components made for them at the time. And this is just incredibly rare. These Iran kits do not pop up very often, and it's quite a rare component, especially for MG3s. And if we look underneath here, you can see it's extremely similar to the MG1A3. It's important to note that the MG1s and MG2s use the exact same top cover as the MG42, while the MG1A3 and MG3 use this shortened design, along with our spring-loaded lever here. And then, finally, let's take a look at our feed tray for the MG3. You can see that this is significantly changed because it does not have, or rather it does have, compared to an original, a much larger section to what would be the lower left when it's mounted on the weapon. And in addition, there is a spring-loaded tab on the bottom, a spring-loaded pawl. This lever here is what the HK plastic drum hinges into. It's the same exact motion as the original drum, except with a much larger and much easier to use locking tab assembly. And again, while this component is much harder to manufacture compared to this original tray, the drums themselves, I would imagine, are much easier to manufacture and much faster. Now let's cover our bolts. Starting with the top two bolts here, the very top one is a German World War II bolt, and the bottom is a M53 bolt manufactured by the Yugoslavians. These are both in 8mm Mauser, and you can see right off the bat, compared to the other bolts, these are quite light. These are the smallest profile overall, and also, very important to note, these particular bolts, the 8mm ones, do not have a spring-loaded peg at the rear. This peg is forged as one piece with the rest of the body, compared to an MG3 peg, which at first glance looks just about the same. However, it is spring-loaded. This is important because when you are closing the top cover on an original MG42, you need to make sure that that track that is in the top cover is aligned properly with this peg. If it is not aligned properly and you slam that cover closed, that can damage it, and you will be a really unhappy camper when you're trying to source those original MG42 parts. Moving on, we have this rail here, which serves as our ejector rail. This rail rides on the inside of this body here. This is a hollow tube. In fact, you can see this one right here. If we can get that to focus right there. That is on the inside, and this differs, the 8mm one differs from our 7.62 NATO because it has this curvature at the rear. Compared to, we'll skip over the two 7.62 NATO bolts for a moment, compared to this ejector style and this spring-loaded device here. This is a anti-bounce device for making sure the bolt head stays in the barrel extension throughout the firing cycle and does not bounce out slightly. These rails are for use with this anti-bounce device as it rides on top of it, and you cannot use that rail with this device. Moving on, we have our 42/59 bolt, and you can see this by far is the absolute largest of the bunch. This is also extremely similar to the MG1A2 slower rate of fire Rheinmetall design. And while it is much larger, it's effectively the exact same function. Still roller lock, still has the rails for the side rails within the receiver. Just as a result of this, the fire rate is much, much slower. And then finally, we have our MG3 style bolt. This is also extremely similar to the MG1A3 bolt. And again, it has this spring-loaded button up top, for lack of a better term. And it does have a little bit more bolt mass to the side. So this does result in a slightly lower fire rate, although still fairly quick. Let's also review the Recuperator rods within the MG42 and the MG3, along with MG1A3, etc. So this top example here is what you would find on an MG42 from World War II, as well as the Yugo M53s. You can immediately tell that this is the earlier style, purely because the Recuperator rod ends almost flush with this stamped sheet metal section, which goes on the bottom rear part of the receiver. Compared to our MG3 Recuperator rod, along with some of the other models such as the 4259, the MG1A3, etc., this Recuperator rod has an extension on the back. This is more room, and you can also see there are different cuts for more spring sections along with guide rods for your Recuperator front end. And again, this is for applying forward pressure to the barrel extension so that it always returns back to the front section where it should be during functioning. And you can also see, one last thing we'll cover, while this top one does not currently have it, there are two small screws. This top one has it in its section. This goes in the front left of the receiver. This goes in the rear bottom and holds it in the lower left channel of the receiver. It's also important to note that these Recuperator rods, for example, the MG3 going into a 42, is not possible due to this extended length. And finally, let's take a look at the buttstock. So, the buttstock to the left here is a German World War II example. And in fact, we have the cut receiver section. This one is an AR code at the very bottom here. So that is Mauser Borsigwald Berlin. And you can see, of course, it's designated MG42, serial number 3099B. And then we have our buttstock. This is a later, what's often referred to as a Bakelite style. This is a non-wood. It is using some wood filler from what I recall, but it's not a solid wood buttstock. This is developed later during World War II, purely because the wood buttstocks did have some issues with the top and bottom cracking off at your either toe down here or this top part where you would nearly rest your cheek. The other issue being that they would very often start splitting at the rear section here, underneath where there are some serrated sections. And if that was allowed to develop badly enough, that stock could simply cleanly crack off of the back metal insert that is in here. As you can see, there are matching interrupted threads, and that is just a 45-degree rotation that goes on. The whole buffer assembly can be removed with this tab, where it rotates out by a 90-degree turn. And then this screw head, which is also a button, is what allows just the buttstock to be removed off the rear of the receiver. It is important to note that the early wood ones are fairly common to see them get replaced, although the M53s, interesting enough, very often post-war were developed with the wood buttstock still, although they did feature the wire wrapping, which was often done in order to try and prevent the splitting of the stock when they were manufacturing them. Let's move on to our 4259 stock here. You can see that this one is extremely similar in the fact that it is a somewhat of a Bakelite, but realistically this is more of a polymer, like a plastic style. This is not necessarily that early style of Bakelite. And this particular one is in very nice shape, but functionally identical to this World War II one that we just overviewed. And it's also important to note, before we leave this, that the buffer style is slightly different. You can see that this solid tube here is different compared to the circular, kind of a corkscrew cut to the buffer on an original 8mm World War II example. And then moving on to our MG3 stock, this is also an extremely similar stock to the MG1A3s, especially in terms of color. And it does have a very similar buffer when compared to the World War II with that corkscrew cut. And it's also important to note that, as you've seen on all three of these, they have this braided wire spring. This is extremely heavy duty, and the beauty of this is that while it is heavy duty in itself, if one of these wires coiled up starts to degrade or even breaks, you're not losing all of the tension of the spring, as it still has some backup from other coils. Now let's cover the barrels and the barrel carriers. Starting with the middle barrel here, this is an original condition with the often proper in the white barrel extension. In this particular one, has a BNZ manufacturing mark, indicating it was manufactured by Steyr. You can see it has a blued finish, which is often appropriate on the barrel section for World War II examples. And then we have another example here. This particular one is also a BNZ, except this one appears to have a very dark phosphate finish, which is possible that it was a post-World War II refinishing at some point. Generally speaking, MG42 barrels were often blued. And then we can also see it's sitting in a barrel carrier. So this barrel carrier is a clamshell design and has small ridges on the inside that are, you can see these small metal stampings that are welded in that allow the barrel extension to sit firmly in there, along with these other stampings that are welded in with a semicircular apparatus that when this is closed, this hooks over the tab lower here and compresses down. That makes for a very nice firm fit with the barrel, prevents damage to the crown or the barrel extension. It's a very convenient carrier. And they are also marked at the back here. So if we get a closer look at these markings, it's a little hard to get into focus, but that is marked Laufschützer 42. This particular one has a CPA4 manufacturing mark, along with a 4 for a assumed to be 1944 date. And then we also have, as mentioned previously, an original World War II example that has not been Yugo refurbished. So, as mentioned earlier, the green apple paint is often an immediate indicator that the Yugoslavians have refurbished something and put it back into service. This also applies to their Lafette mounts. This also applies to the drums and ammo cans, etc. That was their paint of choice and is an indicator of them having acquired it. This tan, however, is, while it is heavily worn, this is proper and original color for a World War II example. And again, exact same functionality. Clamshell design. If we can pop this open with the spot welded in tabs. It's also worth noting that they had MG34 barrel carriers and they had combination barrel carriers that were both for the 34 and 42. And finally, let's move on to the MG3 barrel. This particular one has a manufacturer marking, although this one is extremely light. And you can see it's also phosphated. That's almost always an immediate giveaway that it's a post-war manufactured barrel. And it's also important to note that the barrel extensions from the 8mm and from the 7.62 NATO are effectively nearly identical. You may see some very minor machining differences, such as the contour on this shoulder here compared to this shoulder here, but the locking recesses and the roller locking function are identical. It's really all that matters is what's in the chamber. Your chamber can be for 7.62 NATO like this, or 8mm. Many other folks have also rechambered these to different cartridges. It's really just depending on if you can get a cartridge to function with the push-through belt, and then you can remove this barrel extension, make a new barrel, and it can be chambered in a variety of calibers. And also, it is important to note that when you have for example, a 7.62 NATO barrel in, you need to have all of the appropriate other components, such as the muzzle booster, top cover, etc. Same goes for the 8mm. Now let's take a look at the belt drums, otherwise known as Gurt trommels. Starting with the one on the left here, you can see that this is in the open position for cartridge belts to exit the drum. We can close it by pressing down on the spring-loaded tab and sliding over this whole sheet metal assembly until it locks in place into another hole within the inner frame here. To open it, you do the exact same opposite movement. So we have that open just like that. You can also see that there is a very small rectangular cut so that even when it is closed, the starter tab can be accessed. It's also important to note how this attaches to the gun. So again, as we saw earlier, the feed tray has these small hooks on the left side that, in conjunction with this tab here, it hooks on a rotating motion as such. So it's kind of like an AK mag in a sense, where you nose in against the front and rock it in at a sideways rotating angle. And then this tab is also spring-loaded and simply clips over the back of the feed tray. While we're here, we can also see up close that this particular one is World War II German manufactured. This, from what I recall, this is a Lohmannwerke, although I will have to double check that code. This is also a good time to show how the carry handle works. So the carry handle has two purposes. Of course, number one purpose being that it's ease of carrying the drum. However, the other purpose is that it interacts with this small tab on the side here, which is your tab to hold on this rear lid. So in this current position, the tab cannot be moved away from the drum body, and this cannot be opened. However, if we rotate this over to this position, you can see that the access for said tab is now open. So this can be unclipped as such and popped open. There's also a spring-loaded tray at the rear here to apply tension to the back of your coiled rounds in this drum. It's also important to note that, as you can see, there is no magazine spring, no follower, no other components. This is simply a hollow shell for your 50-round belt to be coiled up into, again, feeding out of what would be this open spot here, and just simply rests in here under tension from, of course, pulling out from the top slot, as well as tension from the rear. So we can close that one up and view our next one here. This is not a German World War II produced one, although it is effectively identical. This was Yugoslavian manufactured, and of course, both of them feature that Yugoslavian apple green paint, along with, you can also see bits of red primer from where the paint has chipped. But this is effectively the exact same drum. So you've still got your spring-loaded tab, still a rock and lock style. Overall, it's a very effective drum for quick use, although this is extremely complicated to manufacture. There are easily over a dozen different pieces of stamped sheet metal, and while it's not a complicated milling operation to produce this stuff, it's certainly not as easy as the later MG3 plastic drum developed by HK for manufacturing. It's also a good time to mention that the MG1A3s and even our 4259, as you can see on the lower one there, they use an extremely similar drum. However, the drum is shorter in overall length. So this drum is, of course, for the 8mm Mauser cartridge. It works on both the MG34 and MG42. However, this does not work on the 7.62 NATO guns, neither the MG1A3s or the MG3s. The MG3s use a totally different drum. The MG1A3 and 4259 style drums are shorter in overall length, meaning that this tab and this tab are much closer to each other, and they are strictly proprietary to that type. And of course, as I mentioned previously, the final development was the HK drum, which is a polymer style. It's a black drum. It's often referred to as an assault drum. Same general size, same general shape, but much easier to manufacture. Since we just looked at the drums, let's take a look at the belts. Starting with this top belt here, you can see that we have the starter tab, and then we have some East German surplus 8mm Mauser linked into the belt. It's important to note, in this particular belt, it is a 100 round for this one. They also made them in 50 rounds, but this 100 round is continuous, even without the rounds in it, from the starter tab to the rest of the links. This differs from some other variations, such as this one here. This is a 50 rounder, and if we zoom out, you can see the difference in length, with this rear portion being continuous. This starter tab is of course separate from the 50, and it is linked together with this small tooth. You can see that this tooth also has a tab on what would be the outside, and it is linked through. You can see there's a very small matching cut along with two other pass-through cuts to allow, when this is assembled through, it allows a cartridge to pass through and link the tab to the rest of the belts. This is pretty standard in terms of the post-war 7.62 NATO DM1 belts, as they're referred to often. While the Germans, they did have some that were 50 round with a separate starter tab. They also had some other variations. As we mentioned previously, this is a continuous 100 round. And we can also see that this one is German, although the markings are a little bit small and hard to see. If we can get that in focus, you can see that has a 542 via World War II date. So it's a fairly early belt for MG42 applications, but of course this 8mm one works in both the 34 and the 42. Some people can run some variations of the 8mm belt, but it depends on the way the stamping was done. Some of them are what's referred to as a low friction and have trouble running a 7.62 NATO cartridge due to a very slightly larger overall diameter, while some other variations of the 8mm belt do not have trouble. It just depends on the exact stamping variation. When it comes to the 7.62 NATO belts, of course, they run 7.62 NATO perfectly fine, and you can get away with running 8mm because of a slightly different design in this link, which will fit 8mm, although it will be slightly looser. It's also important to note that these MG1A3 style 50 rounders work, of course, in the MG1A3. When it comes to the MG3 is capable of running both these DM1 links as well as the German DM6 disintegrating links. If we haven't mentioned this already, of course, these are the non-disintegrating belt sections. The very latest version of the German MG3 with what is referred to as a O or a 0 marked top cover can also run US style or NATO style M13 disintegrating links. So it's capable of running the DM1 belts, the DM6 disintegrating belts, and the M13. Well, folks, thank you very much for watching this overview of the MG42 and its associated variants. This has been quite a longer video than what we're used to doing, but nonetheless, if you enjoy this type of video, feel free to leave us a like, comment, let us know if you like this type of content, as well as subscribe for more. Thank you very much for watching. God bless.